winning $3 million in Best Ball Mania. That's what we're going to do today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find my newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. Shawn, we're going to jump into Underdog. Our last couple shows, we've talked through some early draft strategies. I've been doing some slow drafts, and you and I, we were talking because we took a little hiatus this spring. We haven't even drafted a team together this year. It's June. I'm really excited.
This should be so much fun. We did those couple of shows, one kind of looking at overall strategy and then some tactics, especially within the first 10 rounds. And then we got to do our big running back dead zone show in the last episode. I feel like we're ready to go. And you've done some drafts. I've done some drafts. It's been a lot of fun drafting with our good friend Peter Overzet on the Best Ball Banana Stand. Those drafts, Ben, are very challenging because the rooms end up with a lot of badges most of the time. And if not, then they tend to end up with people from Pete's Discord. And so either way, that's going to offer you a pretty significant challenge. Plus, when you're talking about your picks, it sets up other people to snipe you. You and I are going to obviously be recording as we draft, but no one else will know what we're doing here. So we have a little bit more flexibility to chat through. We'll see whether or not that allows us to pick a better team. But as you mentioned, this is going to be so much fun. Best Ball Mania 4, $3 million to first. And I mean, it's June. This is like the best thing that you can be doing.
Yeah, and I'm so excited because, I mean, I was just telling you before the show, this is my kids' last week of school this week. Busy around the Gretch household. They're at two different schools this year. I think we've talked about it a little bit on the show, but it's been a busier year getting used to having events at two different schools as opposed to when they were at the same school. You know, it's not just drop off and pickup times, but it's, you know, the after school events and stuff. You start to realize there's a lot of stuff. We were at a band concert last night for my older daughter. She got a little solo. It was a great time. And she did awesome. But it's this, you know, busy time of year. And where I was going with this is I have not been consuming a lot of other content. I've definitely listened to your show with Pete a few times and loved it, but I haven't gotten to listen to it as much as I wanted to. And so, like, you and I, not only have we not drafted together, we've talked about a lot of stuff, but I'm usually very in tune with guys you like and guys you don't like because we've recorded a lot of stuff. Instead, I've heard a little bit through the grapevine from other people because people are always whispering about who Shawn Siegele likes this year. And it's aligned a lot with the stuff that I've already been on kind of organically. I mean, no real surprise. Our processes are very similar. I think listeners are aware of that. But I'm excited. And I think, you know, in our discussions these last couple episodes, we're very aligned this year. And I think the way that the last year played out, 2022 was a very unique season in how it played out. I think it's pushed people towards where they want to be. And I think most strategies are very doable because there's no like clear overarching trend in the ADP. I don't think. I mean, clearly on Underdog, wide receivers have gotten a lot more expensive, but stuff like QB is getting more expensive. Is a certain, you know, subset of people are very attracted to that. You and I have been less, you know, a little more wary. We're willing to take early QBs, but a little more wary of that. And I just think it has created a 2023 drafting landscape where you can be more aligned with what you actually want to do. You're not sort of like forced certain directions. And so I found not just in hearing our thoughts being aligned, but with a lot of the other people that I think similarly to, as I've talked to them, they're approaching 2023 similarly, which makes it a fun year, right? It makes it like an exciting year for drafting where you can kind of do what you want to do. And you're not, I mean, like Leone's a good example. Our buddy Mike Leone, some years he and I joke that we feel like we're like 90% aligned, but the 10% is where we spend a lot of time bickering because we have to. But this year it's been so much easier. The ADP sort of allows us to be more in that 90% space with our discussions where we can just be very aligned when we're chatting. So I'm really excited to draft with you. What I'm most excited for is those little moments, and we haven't fired up the draft yet. It's going to be quick. It's going to fire off. We don't know what our draft pick's going to be. Because when you start on Underdog, obviously the draft starts and you go and you got 30-second timers. And so we wanted to do a little discussion before. But once we get going, it's going to be fun to see those little moments where it's, you know, this is the direction we could go for this build. This is the direction we go for another build and kind of see how we both want to go. We both have some reps under our belt, certainly drafting a couple dozen teams each at least. I'm sure you've done more. I've done a few dozen teams now myself. And so it's going to be really fun to see those little decision points throughout drafts, and as aligned as we are on players, on builds and all of that. Anyway, I'm kind of geeking out. This is gonna be a blast.
It's gonna be a lot of fun, and I think these drafts are extremely important. Number one, so that you know that you're doing a good job for listeners and subscribers with your overall content and rankings. You have to participate if you want to put out good content. But then number two, the draft is a great opportunity to get in there and see if what you've been discussing and what you've been working on and what you've been writing about is working for you in the actual tournament that you're trying to win. So we're going to get in there. We're going to draft some of our thoughts. We'll have a little bit of reaction afterward to see if it went the way that we thought it would. And then, Ben, one of the things that I always really enjoy from these drafts is afterwards, I'm then very fired up to write, because there are a lot of different little ideas that are sparked during the draft. So that part of it, I think, will be really cool as well. What do you think? Ready to get this going?
Let's fire it up. We are ready to go. If you are not on YouTube, now's a good time to mention that you can follow along with the actual draft board, the video version of it on the RotoViz Radio YouTube channel. Definitely make sure to subscribe when you go over there. But yeah, you can watch our beautiful faces in the tiny little corner, but also our queue and all of those things as we discuss some of these things that we won't be able to get for the listeners. We'll try to get everything that we can out there for the listeners. One of the really hard things is making sure that we're kind of mentioning who was on the board when we made certain discussions. It kind of, you don't have a lot of time. So you wind up talking about like a couple options. But yeah, that's why I say if you go over to YouTube, go to the RotoViz Radio channel, you'll be able to follow along. Shawn has dropped us into a draft. It is, I think, like 10 people filled. It should, all the way fill up here in a moment, and we'll know what our draft slot will be.
So then 2 people left. What slot in an ideal world would you have us get today?
Really anything other than like the 7 and 8 spot. And 6 if the top 5 go sort of as the top 4 receivers. And well, I mean, I don't mind taking Kelsey at 6. So 6 is kind of a fun spot, but once you get past 6, I think 7, 8, 9, I'd rather just be at like 11 and 12. I think there's some really fun builds you can do at the very back of the draft. And then obviously, if I could have my preference, it would be top 2, and we can get Jefferson or Jamar Chase, because those guys are really good at football.
They are, and they project extremely well in the Win the Flex tool, along with obviously probably getting a little boost on top of that if you're not looking at who those guys are, just top wide receivers, you might not be fully factoring in. Although we know that Justin Jefferson's season from last year, Cooper Kupp's season from 2 years ago, is going to be impacting how the tool is seeing those top wide receiver seasons.
I called it. We get the 107, Shawn, 107. Right? Exactly where you asked what I wanted, and I started with what I didn't want. It's that pessimism that got us, Shawn. If I would have said what I actually wanted first, we probably would have landed somewhere better.
I still like this. I like being in the middle. I think there are a lot of things that we can do and a lot of values that we can grab. It'll be interesting to see how drafters play the beginning. It'll be interesting to see if everyone is completely kind of before we not worried about that Tyreek Hill incident.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. Tyreek could slide. That sounds like not a massive thing, but it's not entirely. I mean, the deal with the Tyreek Hill thing, for anyone who hasn't heard, it sounds like he maybe pushed or hit a worker on a boat of something like a chartered fishing boat or something. The initial reports were that person wasn't going to press charges. That has apparently been a little bit in dispute. It doesn't sound like it was a super physical thing. It's also one of those things where NFL precedent sort of dictates that if there was a suspension, that probably wouldn't happen for the 2023 season. It's just sort of the reality of the order of operations of things. It would be a really quick one compared to, like, say, Alvin Kamara, what happened with him last offseason. It's probably not a major 2023 fantasy draft implication, but something to think about. There Could be a discussion here, Sean. I know you're pretty high on Travis Kelce. Had someone ask me about this, that your ranking on Kelce is pretty high. I think maybe third overall or something in your underdog rankings. If he goes and the top 4 receivers, and Hill does go third, and McCaffrey, so the top 4 receivers go 1, 2, 3, 4. Hill and Kupp go 3 and 4. If we get McCaffrey and Kelce here, we have a discussion at 7, and I can go a lot of different ways there. I've typically been going with one of the running backs, and I think I've typically been going Bijan, and it looks like actually Diggs goes 6, so we can go Kelce.
We can. I like him a lot more if we think that we'll be able to get Patrick Mahomes. I really like the running backs here. I like both Bijan and Austin Eckler. I think they allow you to do a lot of different things. I don't have a lot of Bijan. Is he someone you have any interest in?
I do have interest, but I don't mind doing the Kelce build either. I think if you have Kelce ranked higher, you want to go Bijan today? All right, we're going Bijan.
For me right now, I think one of the things that we're really looking to find out is just where those quarterbacks end up. One of the things that I did last night, Ben, was set up a really cool Sam Howell build by getting Deebo Samuel and Jahan Dotson early. And then Trevor Lawrence fell way below ADP. And so I'm thinking I'm going to go ahead and take this. I'm going to try and set it up there with Zay Jones or Evan Ingram, because if Lawrence is going to fall this far, if I take him, then it's going to push people off those other guys at least a little bit. I'll have a shot at them, and I'll still have a chance to put that couple QB late element in. But CeeDee Lamb had been my pick in the first round. And then Dak Prescott also falls well below ADP. The Jaguars receivers were taken at or above ADP. And so I end up with a Trevor Lawrence share that, I mean, it's at a good value, but doesn't really make sense. And is it going to be a good value in 2 months? I mean, it may just be a player that I took at a great value today that breaks that team and also doesn't really help me. How does that factor into what you're looking to do with elite QB right now versus what you might be willing to do with it later?
I have not been taking many elite QBs, which is why I was sort of open to the Kelce thing. I mean, I think it's funny. It sounds like you haven't taken as much Bijan. I've done a lot of the builds like you just described, where I've taken some San Fran and Washington players and built some Howell stacks and had some Bijan early. So it's kind of our own exposures that we're driving where we wanted to go there in the first round. I have not taken a Kelce Mahomes stack. I don't think I've drafted Mahomes. So that would have been, a unique thing for me, an interesting path to take. I'm very comfortable with the path we are taking. We're almost on the clock here, so before I really get into the quarterback stuff, the guy behind us took Kelce and took Mahomes in the second round. The wide receivers have gone pretty fast and heavy. Jalen Waddle went 202, but Olave makes it back to us. I really like Olave once we're here, and there's the only receivers behind him are T. Higgins and Devonta Smith. You have him at the top of the queue. I'm assuming you like him as well.
I do. He's the player by ADP. I wouldn't be surprised at all if Smith or Higgins end up being higher scorers. They're in better offenses. They're still more proven. We got these elite numbers from Olave on a per route perspective last year. I guess I'm still a little bit skeptical that he can do the types of things that you really want from a round 2 pick, where he explodes and more or less, I'd say, win the league for you from round 2. But I mean, you want those round 2 guys to score a lot of points, to have that in the range of outcomes. They've got Derek Carr now as the QB. I don't know that he fits as well for some of the things that drafters might want to do in terms of building some correlation in there. And so I think that there are at least things to consider, but he was really more or less a no-brainer for us in this particular draft at that particular pick.
Yeah, I mean, he falls in an interesting spot because I agree with everything you said, and I've written about it a little bit at the Substack and talked about it even dating back to last year. The Garrett Wilson-Olave comparison has been one that people have made a lot of. There was sort of a prairie yards element to some of Olave's heavy volume last year, but he was also very efficient. He's very good. He looks like a clear hit, but I like the way you framed it in terms of when you're drafting him in the middle of the second round, he's got to be able to have like top 5 upside, or that's at least the way that I think about a wide receiver that I'm drafting that high. At the same time, where he falls is a very interesting range. Although, Sean, it looks like Devonta Adams actually went after him. We got your ranks loaded in here, it looks like, and you're pretty low on Devonta Adams this year. I did not realize Adams was still on the board.
Yes, and that's something to mention. I was trying to figure it out because these actually look like the previous iteration of the rankings, even though I loaded in the new ones last night for a draft. So I'll have to check out exactly what's happening there. But yes, there is a version of my rankings in the draft here. I'm not very high on Adams. Would he have been the clear pick for you?
I don't know if clear is the right word, but I do think just based on ADP and everything, I probably would have leaned that way. He typically goes at the 1-2 turn, and so there's a little slide there. He ends up going even later in the second. We're almost back up here in the third. Shawn, the guy you have at the top of the queue right now is Breece Hall. When he falls to 307, which is where he would be falling here if we get an opportunity to take him, we were one pick away. I think he's an absolute smash, and I have gotten a lot of him. He does fall. DK Metcalf goes ahead of him. Deebo Samuel, Josh Allen working back where the picks ahead of him. We're going to be running back, but I think with Bijan and Breece Hall, you're talking about potentially the next wave of superstars.
So we're going to go ahead and click that, not waste any more time. That one I think is really exciting. In my rankings, I do have him as the 205. And so you get him in the middle of round 3. Now, obviously, we could have taken him last round, but when you know what the price is going to be, you're going to not try and get 100% exposure. You're going to try and get better prices like we just did there. But I've mentioned a couple different places, trying to build a little sort of long-term enthusiasm for it, Ben. Maybe it's just because it's my favorite show. We like to do the show looking forward to ADP the following year. And even within the context of these wide receiver avalanches, I don't think it's impossible that when you talk Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall, that they are the 101 and 102 in 2024. We have them on the same team. Obviously, we're going to have a little pressure on us at the wide receiver position, but I mean, that's a pretty exciting start.
I think not only is that not possible, I think I would argue the odds-on favorite is that an RB will be 101 in 2024 because people just want that. Right. And so like this year, the issue is there's no running back that you can elevate that high, but there are so many running backs that are in, and those are two of the best examples that are in this range where if they have a great season, show great health, they'll be right back in the top 10 next year. And, top 3 is really the way to put it. I think we will wind up with, and those are the two. I mean, it'll be fun to do that show. We love doing that show. Usually every August, it'll be our look at the 2024 first round. But Shawn, yeah, I think Bijan, Breece Hall in the top 5. That's a little teaser. I think we're both going to be in on that take. We're heading back towards the 4th round. We have 2 running backs now, Bijan and Breece. Chris Olave is our only receiver. We both really like him, but maybe don't think he has like true elite anchor your wide receiver build, elite number 1 type upside, or shouldn't say that because I think we probably would both argue that he does. It's just the probability of him turning in that season may be less likely than just him turning in a really strong like wide receiver 5 season, which still makes him a viable pick in that range, I think. Having said that, we're definitely targeting receivers here as we approach our 4th pick. You have the queue loaded up with some interesting options. I like all of them. Jerry Jeudy, DeAndre Hopkins at the top. They're also the top by ADP. And I'm comfortable with both. I mean, you've talked me into Jeudy a lot over the last year. I wasn't as into him last year. His targets per out run took another step forward this past year. He just looks like a guy who's been on an upward trajectory every year of his career. And even in a bad situation, drew good volume and was efficient after the volume.
And when you think about even going back to the rookie season when his air yards profile was up toward the top of the NFL, you look back to what he was doing both sort of overall and on a per route basis when he's sharing the field at Alabama with Devontae Smith and Jalen Waddle, 2 players who go in that 2nd round right now. I mean, really what he's looking for is a healthy stretch and decent quarterback play. With the strong finish last year, I just think this is the blow-up shot. And because of wide receiver ADP in 2023, you don't actually have that many chances to put together teams with a lot of upside for the pick. I mean, you're drafting some upside, but most of it's priced in based on kind of where you are with the draft. Now, a little bit of that is just if you're going to have the running back values fall and balance it out, you can still do some of those kinds of things. But I like that selection there. Ben, one of the things that you and I have talked about a decent amount is this idea of reaching for one or the other. And right now it looks like Keenan Allen is the guy that you really need to reach for. He has risen a lot. We've been drafting him early, talking about him on the shows, that type of thing. If you put those two guys together in rounds 3 and 4, I think that that's pretty fun. The other question that I had there, and it looked like there was a possibility that he could come back by ADP, but he goes actually just a few picks later, was Chris Godwin. One of the issues that I have with this Olave selection, and I talk all the time about how don't overemphasize the tournament to the point where you build bad teams, but the Saints face the Giants, the Rams, and the Bucks during that playoff stretch. That's not particularly exciting. You're not really thinking that those games are going to shoot out. But with Godwin as someone that we think is undervalued, he would have been a potential reach at that point to kind of go with Olave. And yet I'm just getting so much of him to reach by that much when he might have come back.
It's funny how much ADP has shifted, because I got a lot of 104s, 105s, 106s when I entered all these slows a couple of weeks ago, and I got a lot of Olave in the second round, and I got a lot of Olave with Godwin in the 5th. You can't get Godwin in the 5th anymore. And then we were talking about the Keenan Allen Judy thing. I reached to do that a couple times at the 3-4 turn, and I've talked about that on the show a little bit. And now it's like you almost can't do it at the 3-4 turn. It's going to be a popular thing at the 3-4 turn now. When I was first talking about this, it was, both those guys were at ADPs in the middle of the 4th. We are back on the clock, Shawn. This is we're flying through this draft. It looks like JSN is top of our queue here. You also have Dobbins. I mean, I would be fine with taking Dobbins in the 5th, but I don't really love it when we already have the 2 running backs. I think we do need to get another receiver here. JSN at 55, a little ahead of ADP, but he's a guy that we're both really in on. He really easily fits the thing that we've talked about on the show a lot over the last couple of years, where he's being held down not by his profile, but by what people can see in a projection. There's been so much emphasis put on the Seahawks' past use of 2 tight end sets at a high rate, and a Pete Carroll quote, which nothing Pete Carroll's ever said has ever been believable in his entire head coaching tenure. But he made one little comment where he was like, "Yeah, we still want to use 2 tight end sets." He's never been reliable for anything he's ever said on a usage standpoint. Like, literally, go back and look. I'm going to have to bleep that one out. Thank you to our editor, Colin Kelly. But the fact that the fantasy industry is so interested in this one little Pete Carroll quote in the middle of May, where he talked about how they still want to use 2 tight end sets even after they had drafted JSN, despite the fact that their coordinator came over from the Rams last year, where the Rams had used a ton of 11 personnel for a lot of years. We wanted to fit Tyler Lockett into a Cooper Kupp role in Shane Waldron's offense last year, or people did in the community. JSN looks like he's been drafted to fit that role, that slot plus role, the Cooper Kupp role in Shane Waldron's LA Rams influenced offense. I mean, it just seems so obvious they're going to run more 11 personnel to me this year. And the idea that they would draft him this high in the first round and not actually use him is just a ludicrous, absolutely ludicrous opinion in my mind. I just think, and even if that does happen to a certain degree, you have to understand there's still a lot of upside scenarios. I'm kind of just going on a little soliloquy here while you prepare our picks in the 6th round. How are you feeling about this pick that we're on deck for?
Well, one of the options we could have gone with last round would have been Brandon Ayuk. He is a threat here to make it to us. Oh, he goes one pick ahead.
He went off.
We got a badge taking him at a 14 pick discount. That's not a huge surprise. Then we have Deontay Johnson, who goes nicely with the JSN selection. I mean, I might lean that direction, but I also like Mike Evans for the Olave.
I would take either of those. I have less Deontay. Let's do him. Yeah, so we're in a spot here and we're running low, but we have some interesting bringbacks on multiple picks. We have the JSN pick that we can bring back with Deontay or even George Pickens, which might be an option next round. We have Mike Evans, as you mentioned, as a potential bring back on the Olave selection. We're not going to be able to have that bring back on Olave now. But what are you going to do?
You're going to play Olave and hope that he scores, and the rest of those games just don't do much of anything, which is actually how I project them. So
yeah,
that part will, I think, be fine, especially now that we have both sides of the Seattle-Pittsburgh game. It's not that easy to do unless you reach for one of the guys like we did with JSN. But once you reach for JSN, it's really pretty incumbent upon you to go ahead and get one of those Steelers.
Yeah, and just to finish my big rant on JSN, look, you mentioned a moment ago when we took the Jerry Jeudy pick. There's not a lot of opportunities to get good value. JSN in the fifth or like upside value. JSN in the fifth round, I think, pretty clearly represents that. I mean, I was getting a little ahead of myself saying there's almost like no way that they don't increase their 11 personnel usage. Who knows what Seattle will do? I've never been able to predict them particularly well, but I do think that JSN is going to play well when he's on the field. I think that they're going to run. Even their high rate of 2 tight end sets last year still leaves them as a primary 11 personnel team, I'm pretty sure. I mean, almost every team in the NFL runs more 11 personnel than anything else. They didn't really have a third receiver last year that was worth getting on the field. They're going to run enough 11 personnel, basically, that JSN's still going to run 50% routes or 60% routes. He wouldn't be the first slot receiver at that rate to still be productive, is what I'm saying. I think towards the end of the year, even if he starts at that range, you'll see it increase. And there's an obvious contingent upside as well in any of these situations. This is what I started by saying. When you have 3 guys in an offense being projected really high and we can't project volume for all of them, and that's sort of holding down their ADPs, there's obvious upside as well. If something were to happen to a Lockett or a Metcalf, then things could consolidate for JSN really quickly. There's just so many ways he can pay off at this price, and yet, the feel from a projection standpoint is this is still too high. You can't get enough targets, and I see a lot of those comments, and that's great. That actually makes him a target. That's something we've talked about on the show in the past. That tells you there's latent upside from that ADP for him to actually be a good pick, as opposed to the people that are crunching the numbers and only crunching the numbers saying he can't get enough targets to make this value, seeing him as a bad pick.
And I have even some more thoughts on JSN, but we are 1 pick away here. Now we're on the clock. Somewhat surprisingly, Mike Evans did make it back around to us. Quentin Johnston is also a very viable play to go with Jerry Jeudy.
I think from an ADP standpoint, I prefer Evans at such a steep discount, but it's so funny that we have, again, our options between two viable plays as bringbacks, and in both cases, we wind up taking the veteran Deontay Johnson and Mike Evans. Not how our builds usually look, Sean.
Well, but I think that it shows, at least for me, then ideally you'd get just all peak superstars, but those guys are mostly going in the top couple of rounds, right? And one of the things that these drafts are giving us, at least early, is they're giving you the really wide range of outcomes, guys, and they're giving you the stars with a lot of volume who maybe are a little bit less exciting than they usually are because of the quarterback and the direction. But now you look at this. One of the things, too, with these sort of NFC South games, would this game be even better if it were being played in the Dome? Yeah. But, I mean, Tampa Bay, New Orleans, when we're thinking about exposure to weather in the final week and games that just should be very pleasant, could be extremely high scoring. I mean, Mike Evans at that point in a wide receiver heavy year, it's really pretty silly. I mean, I'm going to be the first person to tell you that Baker Mayfield can go out in any given game and throw 15 passes into the line of scrimmage, but Mike Evans at that price is still pretty ridiculous.
Yeah, incredibly. And I agree with you that we feel very comfortable that weather's going to be no issue in Tampa Bay, at least relative to obviously outdoor stadiums in the north of the United States. So that is an easy move. We're heading towards our 8th round pick here, Sean. We're losing the wide receiver window quickly. You have Elijah Moore at the top of our queue. I have been unable to really place feelings on him, but he does make it to us. I do like to get a 6th receiver before the wide receiver window really slams shut. He's a guy, if you take a longer view, you look at his production profile in college, you look at that rookie season, you can write off year 2 a little bit if you're willing to include the prospect production, which is something that we talk about doing.
Yes, and if you're okay here, I'm going to go ahead and click. Will that work?
Yep.
Okay, so we take Moore. I recently have a piece up on him at RotoViz. Anybody who wants to get more of my feelings on it, there's more of a deep dive there. But Ben, just kind of going back through and actually researching JSN, it jumped out to me how crazy Elijah Moore's yards per route numbers were in his final season, which again was done at a very young age. And then you look at his rookie season, and it's just kind of funny because I've obviously been down on Amari Cooper, and that was incorrect last season. But I think that now that he's even more expensive and you have some other ways to play it, he's got maybe some more target competition. I again find myself somewhat skeptical. So I'm prepared to be wrong on that. But when you compare Moore to Cooper 2 years ago, when you got a 21-year-old rookie and a 27-year-old sort of peak wide receiver, and one of them playing with the Jets, the other one playing with Dak Prescott, yeah, Cooper got a lot more routes, and that matters because you got to do it on more volume. But their yard per route numbers are kind of across the board, except for yards per target. But the other elements of the peripherals actually favor the 21-year-old rookie and more. You had the terrible season last year, but that is factored in a meaningful way. I mean, he's still not super cheap, but in a meaningful way to his ADP. I like getting him as kind of the last guy in that wide receiver window that you mentioned.
Yeah, I can definitely get on board with that. Like you just went back into his prospect profile, and this is the point I want to drive home. I think the market, and we've talked about this on the show a ton, too heavily weighs only the NFL production. Once we get some NFL sample, the college stuff still happened. It's still football games. He was playing in the SEC. Obviously, it's not the NFL, but it gets way too out of mind, out of sight, out of mind by the market. And he was very good at a young age, as you said, for 3 seasons in college, drew volume, and then as a rookie. And then last year, it was a crazy, weird season that things didn't go well. We're back on the clock here in the 9th. We're at a 2-6 build right now. 2 running backs, 6 receivers. We're starting to enter into the running back window. You have Javonte Williams at the top of the queue as our target. I've been a little worried about his health. Haven't been snapping him up a ton, but I do like we should take him, Shawn. You're moving him out of that spot. If you want him, let's go for it. Because we do have Jerry Jeudy as well. So a little correlated bet on the Denver offense.
And he comes at a pretty significant discount. So one of the things that is at least mildly fun in this draft, and we had to do JSN early to make that part work, but otherwise we've been getting some good values. Breece Hall comes in right around where he normally goes there in round 3, but then you get Mike Evans around below ADP, you get Deontay Johnson right around the price, but you get Elijah Moore 3 or 4 picks below. You get Jerry Jeudy, who's rising at about his price, and then we get Javonte Williams at a 9-pick discount there. The reason I kind of flipped it at the end, and for those of you listening, you can't see, James Cook was the other name that I had moved above him. Cook was also below ADP there, and there's a possibility that we could go Cook and then come back with P. Ryan. Again, that's one of the elements here where with the short clock, you don't necessarily have time to discuss all of that nuance, but that's kind of what I was thinking. If it works out that we could have gone Cook, P. Ryan, would that have been your preference?
That would be interesting. I don't know if it would have been my preference. I like P. Ryan more in more 0RB builds. When we have Bijan and Breece anchoring, I'm not really as concerned about the early season points. I like Javonte on this build, particularly as the RB3. Now we have the potential for, 3 guys that could be the top 3 scoring running backs during the fantasy playoffs. That's the bull case for Javonte, is that, yeah, you might not get a lot of production early, but he has the talent. He was productive enough. And if he comes back healthy enough, you're talking about the potential for him to be an absolute superstar down the stretch and be one of those guys that's in the discussion next year as a first-round running back again, because he's at that age that he could, vault right back up to that if he plays healthy enough this year. So now, not needing to rely on him for the early season points, really like having him in this build. Cook's still on the board as we get back. You just added Pat Freiermuth to our queue. We're in the 10th round. He would be 8 picks behind ADP as our tight end 1. He's the last tight end that I really like the upside for. We already have a little bit of Pittsburgh, Seattle love. With running back still being something we can maybe hit down the line, I think I would lean Freiermuth. I know you really like Cook, though, as a potential RB4 here. What do you think?
Well, his upside is so extreme. I've kind of been moving Freiermuth and the Steelers guys down a little bit just so I don't get too crazy.
But this is behind ADP
exposures. But as you mentioned, this is going to be far below ADP. It's hard to pass on Cook at such a crazy value.
I know.
And yet, this sets us up to have that Steelers Seahawks game shootout. And it also creates a little bit more protection. you and I think, Ben, are both pretty high on Kenny Pickett, but you want to be high in a way that when you're right, you actually win and gain something from it. And you want to try and set up your teams to where you're not constantly sort of spiraling yourself upward on the price and on the exposures. So I've been trying to be careful with the way that I approach the Steelers. And yet, I mean, that's a great price there. We're also protecting the Kenny Pickett price. He's not going to be as appealing to other drafters late, at least for sort of a reach above ADP. And his actual price is very easy to pay. You're just hoping that no one takes him several rounds early.
Right. Do you want to star him real quick? Because the part of the reason I like the Fire Me thing was we would be able to throw Pickett into our queue and help our zero QB, late round QB build as well. I think he makes a lot of sense now that we have both pieces in the Pittsburgh game. But yeah, you just start Geno. He's also there. I feel like we're getting a lot of values behind ADP in this room. This is a fun room. Geno, I would have expected to be off. In most of my slow drafts, the QBs don't usually tend to slip like this. Yeah, having JSN and 2 bringbacks in that game. The other one is the New Orleans-Tampa game. We have both sides of, I don't really love playing Derek Carr, but he sometimes falls way behind ADP, so he can be a viable pick. And then we also have now multiple pieces of Denver, and so Russell Wilson becomes – we have a lot of outs is what I'm getting at in terms of building out these stacks. Maybe we didn't need to prioritize Pickett. I'm hoping, and we've seen a lot of running backs go here. I'm hoping that was an interesting decision, that James Cook Freiermuth decision. I'm still kind of laboring over it. We are back on the clock, Sean. We do have 3 really strong running backs. You have Kendre Miller as the top name on the board. Rondale Moore is the top available receiver. I've taken a lot of Rondale, honestly, just looking at the available targets there. Do you want to go Dulcich? I just saw you start him as well and keep building out Denver. We can take Kendre. I take a lot of Kendre as well.
So I went ahead and, with your last note there, kind of vaulted Dulcich up because we are in a position where both he and Miller have ADPs that would put us exactly at our next pick. And so potentially taking the player who is more important to building out some of those game stacks is the way to go here. I mean, I have a lot of Dulcich, and so I'm definitely trying not to take him above ADP, but after getting a lot of values, we did hit a spot that was pretty flat.
Yeah, that was tricky. The only one that was even really close was the Rondale Moore pick if we wanted to get our wide receiver 7 already at that point. I'm fine leaving that open to potential back stacks. You just started Tyquan Thornton, who is a guy I've taken a ton of, and I've taken him, and I know you have as well, taken him. You and Pete took him way above ADP. I've taken him like 20 picks ahead of ADP. I have been loving the Mac Jones, Thornton, Gesicki, Hunter Henry combinations that you can make at the end. New England, really tough schedule in the fantasy playoffs, as Pete Overzet pointed out to me, but like still the prices you have to pay there to get a little stack element. And often, you have some Buffalo exposure. Maybe you have James Cook or Damian Harris, or you got a Gabe Davis on that build. Even Dawson Knox is another guy that can build out that game. It's such an easy way to play late stacks. Kendre Miller does make it back, Sean, but so does Russell Wilson behind ADP. And we have all these Denver pieces now. I'm fine just going Miller and continuing to push quarterback though, because we have multiple options there.
And I think that there's a chance that because we have a couple of those quarterbacks somewhat blocked off, again, you want to be aware that your opponents can do anything. They're not prohibited from taking your stack pieces. But especially in an environment where I think we're going to get some very inexpensive QBs in where we want to get that 4th back with some upside. Now, Colin Kelly and I have a show coming out sometime in the near future here. We had to record a few early as Colin is going on vacation, but it looks at this sort of reverse engineering your build element. And one of the things that we did find is we do like a lot of the running backs late. So we go through this area of the draft where running back prices are not particularly compelling. The running back names are not compelling, but then as you get to the end, you can fill it out. So now that we have
easy
up to 4, there's really no issue at all. we're looking more in that kind of fun group of players in Thornton, Mims, and Curtis Samuel if we wanted to do anything there with another one of our late quarterback favorites. And yet, I mean, I'm not – Russell Wilson doesn't appeal to me very much, Ben. And yet, with the way that we have this put together, if we get him
It's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I found myself taking him more than I want to, just with a few different stacks, because I have taken some Judy. I've been okay taking some Sutton. I think you're probably lower on Sutton, but he's right on that fringe of the end of the wide receiver window where you have to make some decisions about whether the guy is a part of the wide receiver window or not. I can tell myself a little bit of a story on Sutton. We'll save that for another day. But I've gotten into some situations where, and because I'm taking a lot of the Chargers as well, Keenan Allen, Quentin Johnston particularly, I have that game kind of built out a little bit, but I can't get access to Herbert. And so I've thrown Russell Wilson into some of these late round quarterback builds when he's fallen, taking a little more of him than I want, because I do think there's scenarios with Denver, even when you've built it out as much as we have, that like Sean Payton, we've talked about this on the show. Sean Payton, they got to make a decision this year. Russell Wilson's due at the end of, or the third or fifth league year day of next year. His 2025 salary becomes guaranteed. They will need to cut him before then, or be beholden to him, not just through 2024, but also 2025. They are currently stuck with him at least through 2024. But I think Peyton, you read the tea leaves, you see some of the things he said in the offseason, is maybe setting himself up to actually be moving on from Russ before 2025, which would mean cutting him at the end of the year, which would mean some potential bench risk, I think, in season if he's struggling, moving on to, I think it's Jarrett Stidham, right, that's backing up. And it wouldn't be that surprising to me if the Broncos season, if Russ struggles again, pans out in a way where he gets benched, they kind of move on. Stidham actually makes his offense decent enough, because Sean Payton is a good offensive coach, that these players can still hit a little bit with a guy like Jarrett Stidham at quarterback, and you don't actually need Russell to build up the stack. Obviously, the most likely scenario for all of these guys hitting on the same roster, though, is Russell Wilson playing to a decent level in a Sean Payton offense. And Sean, we're back one pick away. We'll be on the clock at 151. His ADP is 132.7, and he made it.
I mean, you've not convinced me he's going to get benched, though.
Yeah, I know. It was probably not good. Sean, we have to take him. I'm telling you right now. We have Judy, Dulcich, and Javonte Williams, a big bet on Russell Wilson bouncing back, which, like I said, is the most likely scenario for Denver to actually have a good year. It's kind of a post-hype situation. They've been sending out videos from Russell's camp that he's lost a bunch of weight. He looks great, Sean. Best shape he's been in years.
Well, sometimes being forced out of your comfort zone and out of some of the people and processes that you rely on that perhaps maybe they're not even negative, but they haven't been helping you in the way that you think that they are. You get this elite coach in there who there's always this tug of war, right, between the player and the coach. A lot of us have been on both sides of that, and we know both elements of the dynamic. But in an ideal situation, the coach has information and has a perspective that is very helpful. He may be the guy that pushes him back to being, I don't think a star. I just don't think he has that in him anymore. I don't think that he's that type of player. But you don't need to be a star with the weapons they put around him and the offense that they put around him. He just plays all right. And so,
yeah, he can still have spike weeks. He's got enough mobility still, even though he's not going to run as much. He's still got the ability to hit on, deep balls. He's had deep ball. Frankly, he wasn't as accurate last year, but in the past, he's had strong deep ball accuracy, percentages when he's been at his best. So there are elements to his game that could play and at least have some spike weeks. I think he put that well. We're not looking at him being a top 5 quarterback on the full season, but he's a nice bet as part of a late round quarterback build. Sean, we're back on the clock. We have Tyquan Thornton at the top of ADP. He has moved past ADP. I mentioned taking him 20 picks ahead of ADP. I know you've taken him even further ahead of ADP than that. I think he's a great option right now as our 7th receiver.
That's the way I want to go. I want to make sure that you're all right with pushing Pickett beyond his ADP.
Let's do it.
Feeling like we have him kind of protected.
Yep, we have him kind of protected. That's a gamble I'm definitely willing to make now that we have Russ on board and we can get a good price on Thornton. I mean, that is a really nice 7th receiver. I would argue we could close with 7 receivers now. Our receiver room is Olave, Judy, Jackson Smith, and Jigba, Deontay Johnson, and Mike Evans, which are a really interesting part of that build. Elijah Moore and Tyquan Thornton. Sean, when we were talking about the veterans earlier in the show, you kind of alluded to this, but it really helps our earlier bets with Judy, who we talked about how he's scaled up each year 166 yards per route run as a rookie, 185 as a sophomore, 2.18 last year, first year over 2. Those are the PFF numbers. His efficiency has improved each year. He's scaled up in a way that, like, yeah, you can make a case that maybe he's a little bit of a late bloomer, but like he hasn't had great health over the last couple of years. That year 4 could be his breakout big, boom season. JSN, another clearer, even high ceiling swing with maybe a little bit of a floor issue. And then you add volume, but maybe not the most upside in Deontay Johnson and Mike Evans, kind of aging players, but guys that we know are going to run a lot of routes and have been, productive players for a long time. I really like that blend in our receiver room. I think it gives us a really nice mix of floor and ceiling every week. We tacked on Thornton and Elijah Moore as much bigger upside swings late as well. But I think we have like enough projectable targets and those types of things. Obviously, we're not usually thinking through things in terms of projectable volume. But when you look at this build, some people would be worried about like having JSN as our wide receiver 3. I really like the structure of this wide receiver room, and I think we could be done at 7.
And it just was so fortunate for us that we got those veterans after making the reach on the rookies. It complements itself very well, as you mentioned. But the other thing I really like about that Tyquan Thornton pick, we're very heavy on Denver, but we're sort of locked out of meaningful or interesting Chargers selections. But I've discussed a lot how I think that the Week 16 games are undervalued in terms of their importance for winning the tournament. Tyquan Thornton is a guy on the other side of that game for our Broncos. And so that was one of the big reasons, too, that I was really glad he fell to that point.
That's a great call. Yeah, I noticed that you got Denver, New England in Week 16. You also have the Chargers and Bills in Week 16. And then those teams, that foursome matches up in Week 17. So when you do and Mims goes off the board, Pickett does make it back to us, Shawn. So I would definitely lean that way if you're comfortable with it.
Do you feel more strongly about that than, we're in the middle, which gives us a little bit more protection, but he is going to be below ADP now. Chuba is someone we'll probably lose if we pass here.
I'm okay losing Chuba. I like the quarterback here. I think it makes for a really viable 2 quarterback build. I also, as we were talking, we don't have a nice Week 17 bring back on Denver. I like that we do have a Week 17 bring back on Seattle. And so on this roster, now we have a double stack with a bring back. I'm kind of telling myself, okay, when that really important Week 17 hits and we get through to the final, we're playing more through the Pittsburgh double stack with Seattle bring back. And maybe Denver helps us get there in that Week 16 matchup that you talked about. And Pittsburgh helps us in Week 17. You want a game stack. That's something that's been shown effectively by a number of people. One is our buddy Mike Leone, who we mentioned earlier in the show. But you want to have those bringbacks. Those are important. We could, have a couple of our pieces on Denver still have decent games in Week 17, but because we don't have pieces of that Chargers game coming back, we're probably going to be competing with people if this team gets all the way to the final who have Denver as well, because Denver will have done good things. This team is built through Denver pretty heavily. So it's nice that we have this little unique element to our build where Denver can help us get there, but we could actually kind of root against that game a little bit. Maybe a couple of the pieces do well, but Russ doesn't. Maybe the Chargers don't do well. And now we have the Pittsburgh-Seattle game built out. That's a lot of talk about Week 17 correlation. It's not probably that massive, but that was sort of my tiebreaker that I do like that we now have this other quarterback game stacked up really, really effectively at a discount behind ADP to get Pickett. It was really nice to see him slide back through.
And breakout Kenny Pickett is going to be the 2020.
Kenny Pickett, Russell Wilson. I think those are probably 2 of the quarterbacks that got the most "this guy sucks" tweets sent their direction last season. What could go wrong with those 2 as your only quarterbacks?
What could go wrong? So there is still a possibility, I think, to do a 3 QB build if we get to the end and don't like some of our other options. We did just barely lose Chuba. He goes 2 picks ahead of our slot. Some of their names we have in the queue at running back: Chase Brown, Zach Evans. I'll need to move him down a little bit. Travion, Ty Chandler, Dwayne McBride, Pierre Strong. We've got both of those Minnesota backs. I put Gesicki in because he builds out a little bit more of that New England element of the game. And I don't know that our 2 tight ends and Freiermuth and Dulcich close us out of that. Then a lot of different ways we can go. Pick a guy for me here.
Let's do Gesicki. That's who you have at the top of the queue. I probably would have thought of this as a 2 tight end build, and I don't think I would go 3 QBs and 3 tight ends on this team. But it's not because our running backs and receivers aren't strong enough. And so actually I kind of like that we can build that in because we do have enough firepower at running back and at receiver that we could do a 3-5-7-3 fairly easily. You're thinking now we could also add Mac Jones to this because we have Tyquan and Gesicki. And I think that's very, very interesting.
And so kind of to tie this back around to our Underdog strategy show that we did, one of the things that we discussed was that if you go if you go running back, wide receiver in the first 10 rounds, and you really benefit from the running back prices while you're also managing the wide receiver avalanche, and you're getting that receiver room built out, then it gives you the ability to take advantage of some late tight ends, and it gives you the advantage of being able to select QBs if they're the best player late and not select throwaway players. We want as many guys live as possible in the tournament, and that is more difficult to draft in June than it is in August when you have a lot more information. And so those two things kind of work together in a way that is pretty cool. I think the flexibility here is great. If we have running backs that we want to go with the entire rest of the way, we can do that. If we have a receiver who jumps out as a good 18th round pick, we can do that. But if we do want to take Mac Jones, or if we even want to go Sam Howell empty at the end, we can do that. And so then it sets us up nicely for our final 2 picks.
Yeah, I'm liking it a lot too. Will you have started some running backs and close out the running back tab, but will you click on the running back tab for me real quick?
Yes.
Is Cordell Patterson still there? He's a guy that I like to add. I'm talking about live players. I think they're going to use him. Oh no, we have Bijan Robinson. We can't take him. Sorry, I don't want to take him on a Bijan team. I do think he's somebody who will be. Yeah, he's somebody who will be used, I think, a little bit more creatively and actually be a live player. And when I take 5 running backs, I mean, he's just an easy 5th running back. I do think he's going to have usable weeks and some contingent upside. I think he's going to be Sean, I'm going to wind up not taking a lot of Algier, I think, this year, because I think Patterson's still going to get like 5 carries a game. And Bijan's going to get a lot of work. It's going to squeeze Algier. It
makes it tough for him. His numbers were just extraordinary last year, though. He's a big-time talent. He's one of the top 20 running backs in the NFL. So it just is a huge bummer for him that he's landed now in that particular situation.
Yeah, he looked great. I mean, he looks incredible. I don't want to be out on him, but it's, Patterson's an interesting 3rd guy, and Arthur Smith's quotes have really backed that up. Maybe it's a little bit of confirmation bias for me, but we are back on the clock, Sean. You have Tyquan at the top of the queue. That's the guy I would go with as well. Mac Jones does go off the board before our 17th pick. We were hoping to maybe get him and a running back. I think we just take Ty. Easy pick. After ADP, he's been rising. He usually goes a lot higher than this. We're at 199. His ADP is all the way up to 192. I think it's going to settle much higher even than that to get him back around the. You used to be able to get him in the 200s, which was kind of nice before the Dalvin Cook cut.
And I'm going to make the case that once Dwayne McBride is healthy and is out there practicing in training camp and is running free in preseason games, that we're going to get a big McBride push to the point that it does knock Madison even back down as well. But we're not at that point yet. And we know Ty Chandler fits a role in the offense that's going to be there really almost regardless of what McBride does. He gives them the most explosive athleticism, and this is a team that's built around the pass.
But you think McBride's going to wind up going higher than Chandler?
Not necessarily higher than Chandler. I think you're going to get a push on both guys, and you're going to have some moments when he goes early because he's going to look so good. And so that's one of the reasons why I haven't been chasing Alexander Madison. That could obviously be wrong because Alexander Madison is basically the new Joe Mixon, to where he doesn't do things well, but he can do them and he can not hurt you. And the flexibility in a big back, NFL teams just crave that. You could put it out there and just whatever happens, it's going to be fine. I mean, it's not going to help us, but we can throw the ball to Justin Jefferson. So, maybe it works out and Madison is basically Joe Mixon. If you get Joe Mixon's points, then you're fine. So I think that backfield will be interesting to track, but I'm going to have a lot of Chandler and a lot of McBride over the next 60 days or so.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Shawn, we're almost back up on the clock for our final pick. Without really a viable third quarterback, I like going. Well, you just hit the QB tab, and Desmond Ritter's still sitting there. But we don't have stack options for these guys. I like going with Pierre Strong, who you have at the top of the queue. Another good late running back option right now. We do have some New England bets, even though we didn't get Mac. I still like that that's sort of correlated, and we're betting on that offense to be a lot more competent this year now that they have a more reasonable offensive coordinator than Matt Patricia. Is that where you would prefer to go?
I think so. The pick right before us was Travion Williams. If he had been there, it would have been a tough discussion and a tough pick, because you're talking about round 18 and the very possible starter for maybe the best running back situation in the entire NFL. But the reason Travion's going there, obviously he's been in the NFL for a while, hasn't really done anything. If we do get a mix and cut or a mix and suspension, then they probably had somebody like a Leonard Fournette just to like go out there and do the things that Joe Mixon could do. So you probably lose
that was a really interesting, Shawnism where you threw in a really hot take and just kind of kept going like it wasn't a hot take. But you just argued that Travion Williams might be the starter for the Bengals. There has been some talk that Joe Mixon might still get cut and he's going to get asked to get restructured and take a pay reduction. And part of the reason that's waited till now, but will still happen before week 1, is they want to get Joe Burrow's extension done this offseason. So there is stuff that still needs to happen with the Bengals offseason from a bookkeeping standpoint, and that might lead to Joe Mixon actually still being released at this point. At the same time, there's a lot of people that have been arguing Joe Mixon belongs in like the 3rd round. I talked about it on the last show when we were talking about the dead zone that he's somebody who could continue to rise. We've already seen him rise considerably, given that he's made it to the late part of June and hasn't been cut yet. He was in like the 8th round earlier because of some of these risks. He's now sitting in like the 5th round. But Shawn, the way that I looked at this when I went through the Bengals projection was that I made a note that there's a lot of ways this backfield could play out. I think the least likely is that it looks the same as it does right now. I don't think there's really any way, as I'm trying to project this right now with Mixon and Travion and Chase Brown and Chris Evans as the backups, that even if Mixon's still on the roster, I think there's a possibility they bring in a different backup. And this is the part of it that I wanted to bring up as it relates to Travion, is this element of how confident are you when they haven't really used him a lot in the last couple of years that they like him? Have you been hearing good things about that? Because my concern is they haven't really played him as much at all. And it just seems like they don't really like the player that much, haven't really given him the opportunities. Is it possible that they add one of these veterans? I know there was some discussion in the beat writer. I can't remember who it was. I'm trying to remember which beat writer it was, but I thought somebody discussed the possibility of them adding a veteran if they were to cut Mixon. Maybe I'm thinking of the Browns. There was some discussion of maybe the Browns bringing in someone behind Chubb. I don't know. Anyway, what are you thinking about that, Travion potentially being the lead back comment?
I think this is maybe the most fascinating backfield in football for the reasons that you mentioned, and because it's just so valuable. And Samaje Perine looked so good in that situation last year to the point where, it's hard not to draft him now as a member of the Broncos, thinking that he can do Mark Ingram types of things in a Sean Payton offense. And part of that is based on how good Perine probably is. And then part of it is based on what that situation is with the Bengals. One of the things I think happened last year is Perine went out and was just so good that they didn't need to play a third guy in a lot of situations. But also throughout the year, you got the impression that Travion moved by Chris Evans, who was someone they really kind of wanted to take it. I think that Travion is interesting because one of the things that you will see is that these guys who came into the NFL and nobody really liked, and you wouldn't have expected them to stick around, once they do stick around, and there's so many differences in the comparison, but we think back to Alan Lazard and how we were really high on him as a prospect. He falls out of the draft entirely. It takes multiple years to kind of work his way back through. He ends up sticking in the NFL. And then not only does he stick, but little by little, he becomes a more relevant piece for the Packers, and now is expected to be a relevant piece for the Jets. With Travion, you have a player who really put up fantastic numbers in college, but for whatever reason, NFL teams did not think that would translate to the NFL. And as a result, he goes late in the draft. The Bengals get to see him a lot, and they have never really gone to him. And yet he's stuck, whereas other guys have not. And I think that it's interesting because this combination of letting P. Ryan go, being down on Evans, and using a late draft pick. And so in a lot of ways, I think it's similar to what we have with the Vikings, where they're looking at Ty Chandler, but then they're also making that McBride pick. So they have two names that they can throw at it as backups, both of which are interesting if Madison stumbles or gets hurt. When you have Chase Brown being drafted where he was, and even though his prospect profile actually has a lot of great things about it, extremely athletic, well-rounded back, workhorse, when you're talking about a guy who did a lot of those things at a little more advanced age, and you're dropping in the draft, you're not saying, okay, well, this is like a 1-2 pick in the draft. I mean, this isn't somebody they've selected to be a starter, but he gives them that contingent type of play. He gives them not exactly a lottery ticket, but another path. And so when you have the two paths with Travion and Chase Brown, I think they're actually high enough on both of those guys that they're not going to necessarily just add a body. So that would be my thesis. But the reason I mentioned someone like a Fournette, for example, is you have to understand where your thesis may be pretty fragile. And we don't want to end up spending so much on those two players that you've got just so many zeros once it goes in a different direction. But the nice thing about even Chase Brown, who is not expensive, but then especially Travion, is it's a last round pick. And the upside there, you think about, how do you win a tournament and you get points from the 18th round that most people are not getting? I mean, Travion is the perfect example of how you would do that.
That's very well put. And when you compare it to the Viking situation and the McBride ad, I mean, Travion's sort of the Madison in that scenario, with the big exception being he has 55 career touches through 4 seasons. But like you said, he's stuck there through 4 seasons. He's still on the roster. They obviously still see something in him and like him to some degree. Only 8 touches
ahead
last
of
year,
Chase
though.
Brown right now. I mean, just so that we have a good sense of what's happening. I'm not saying that's going to stay. I mean, I've been drafting Chase Brown in basically every single dynasty league. And then you get a bunch of trade offers. Even like if you draft him, it's funny that there's a guy who generates so much interest in the 3rd round, but as soon as you draft him, you have the trade offers flooding in. Now, I love Chase Brown, but Travion right now is ahead. And so we want to track that, but it is something that.
Yeah, and Brown's the one, by comparison, that went in the 16th round here. Travion, we very nearly had as an option in the 18th. He goes 1 pick before us. We do take Pierre Strong. Shawn, let's go through the full roster. We wound up with just Russell Wilson and Kenny Pickett at quarterback. Our running backs are Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall. We got Javonte Williams as a 3rd potential late season big time upside play, but obviously in the 9th round, a little bit of a later pick. So we're still able to build out some receiver depth. Kendre Miller is our running back 4. And then the last 2 rounds, we tacked on Ty Chandler and Pierre Strong. 2 favorites of yours over the last couple of off seasons. We haven't seen a ton out of either of them yet, but both in really intriguing situations, the most intriguing situations they've been in going into 2023. This could be the year for both guys that you've been on, and I know I have stashed on Dynasty rosters at your recommendation for, another late round pair of players that you probably have on all of your Dynasty teams. You just mentioned that about Chase Brown. At the wide receiver position, we have Chris Olave. We took Jerry Jeudy in the 4th, JSN in the 5th, Deontay Johnson, Mike Evans, Elijah Moore, and Tyquan Thornton. And we did finish things off with just the 7 receivers. And then a tight end, Pat Freiermuth, Greg Dulcich, and added Mike Gesicki, a really nice 3 tight end build. I really like Gesicki late, Shawn. He's a guy you've always liked and been high on. Very athletic, very talented. The Patriots got a lot of good looks at him in their division, brought him in. All the camp talk is that he is going to be playing outside this season. He basically has never really been an inline tight end. He's not somebody to think about as, competition with Hunter Henry. They basically play different positions. I think this is another thing that fantasy managers still in 2023 struggle with. When you see 2 guys with tight end next to their name in the same offense, you think about, are there enough tight end targets and this and that? It's not how the football game is played. They don't put a big tight end on their back and say, this is a tight end. If he's lining up at receiver, and he is, last season he was in the slot 51% of the time. He was out wide 22% of the time. He was in line 26. And that was the most he had been in line in 4 years. It was in a new offense. And then that, Mike McDaniel didn't really have a lot of use for him and got rid of him. Mike McDaniel doesn't seem to have a lot of use for tight ends at all. That was after 3 years of his inline percentage being sub 20%. In 2021, it was 7.4%. He lined up outside or in the slot over 90% of the time. So you're talking about a guy that just flat out is not playing tight end. It seems like that's how New England sees him. You can get him incredibly late. We talked a little bit about Pat Freiermuth as we went through there. I really like his profile. His targets per out run rose in year 2. His yards per target rose in year 2. The only thing that didn't rise in year 2 was his touchdown rate. It cratered. But over a 2-year sample, and we know touchdown rate can fluctuate, over a 2-year sample, he has 9 TDs. He had 7 as a rookie. And so his touchdown rate over 2 years still looks fine. He looks like an ascending young tight end talent. Really like his price in the 10th round as one of the last sort of, I think he has upside to be a top 5 overall tight end, top 3 overall tight end. Last real, legit upside tight end options. Dulcich, I'm not quite as high on as it sounds like you are, but we took him around later, and he's another one in that same mold where you're talking about some real upside. And to get Gesicki late, I mean, that's a tight end room that we're going to get a lot of routes and a lot of targets out of.
And I like to build the rooms like that where we have multiple paths in the postseason and that we're likely to get tight end points. If you leave yourself short to where an injury or just being too enthusiastic about a player, I'm not necessarily interested in picking out certain guys and saying, this guy's going to bust, this guy's going to bust, this guy's going to bust. But we know that tight end scoring can be difficult to come by. You give yourself the additional path. There are multiple ways, both from a regular season perspective and a postseason perspective, where that can be helpful. You want the elite tight ends if you can get them at a good price and you think the offense is set up really nicely. But the one situation we really have like that is Travis Kelce, and he goes in the first round. So that was one of our first decisions that we had to kind of work through. It's fun to think that since we did pass, at least we have some fun names in that later range. And again, the cost in Underdog to put that together, where you have the half PPR as opposed to other formats where you have the tight end premium, you can really work that. And you made a great explanation of why Gesicki is someone we should be looking at, but it also works for Hunter Henry, who goes the 4th to last pick. He should be going earlier as well. I can't really say, he should be going in the 12th round when we passed on him all the way through, and including passed on him in the 16th round. But I actually don't think there's a huge difference between the profile that he's going to bring and what people are actually drafting in round 13. You follow the Patriots and this new offense with Bill O'Brien and what Mac Jones is doing and which guys are standing out. And it's Tyquan Thornton, Mike Gesicki, and Hunter Henry. Right. So if those are the guys the offense is going to pass through. Now, we may get more Juju. If he is healthy, you could always get a DeAndre Hopkins. If those things happen, you're going to be dealing with fewer targets. But I like the way this is set up. And then, Ben, you had mentioned Pierre Strong. He's someone where if you told me that he basically gave you a 0, that wouldn't surprise me. And yet, again, the guys who are standing out for the Patriots, we know that this team is going to run through Ramondre Stevenson. I think that he's undervalued. I think he's a very clear 2nd round pick and someone who, if we're talking about the full profile that you need, Stevenson is someone who is just one of really 3 or 4 backs who can give that to you. I think he should be going earlier. But if something were to happen to him, or we know that the Patriots in a perfect world don't want their starter to have so much on his plate that he starts to perform worse or that he has increased injury risk, Pierre Strong is better than people realize. He's extremely athletic. The thing that has been interesting when you track again how they're practicing right now, and you want to be somewhat conservative in terms of conclusions you draw from it, but Pierre Strong is catching passes for them in their offense. If he does that, and he didn't play a lot as a rookie, but when he did play, man, he looked like he was shot out of a cannon. If he does that, then he's going to have some standalone value. The contingent value is extreme. Again, we hope that Stevenson stays healthy. But when you're working through what could happen, my only concern there is that your guy is also generating a little bit of buzz again, Ben. But my understanding is he's actually playing with the backups. So hopefully we're not going to lose Pierre Strong to a 2023 Ty Montgomery.
I don't think I'm super into the Ty Montgomery thing this time around. I wasn't really that into it last time, but no one else paid attention. This time people seem to actually be like wanting to draft him a little bit. I mean, not a ton. He's actually still listed as a receiver on Underdog. Shawn, as you were talking through this New England offense, it's been really intriguing to me. I mean, the Pierre Strong thing is a great point. He's an example for me where I agree with that take a ton, and yet I've only taken 8% of him. And I know that because I pulled up my Underdog exposures. I entered my first slow drafts a couple of weeks ago, and I finished 25 of the 35 that I jumped into. The reason I pulled up these exposures right now is, as you were talking through the late tight ends, they're examples of players that I can sit here on the stream and say I completely agree with those takes. And I also wanted to pull up and see how much I've actually been drafting them, because I feel like I take them in every single draft. Gesicki is my most drafted tight end, and Hunter Henry's tied for my third most drafted. Kyle Pitts is the only one in between there, and I have Hawkinson tied with Henry there, and I have Freiermuth as my fifth highest. I do really like Freiermuth as well. My point being, those are players that I'm actually taking. You mentioned Ramondre. He's my third highest running back. Breece Hall and Jalen Warren I have tied at the top at 36% of both of them. I'm taking a lot of Hall, as I mentioned. And then at receiver, I have Tyquan Thornton as my third highest drafted receiver so far. Chris Godwin, my highest drafted guy. He's the guy that we talked a little bit about earlier. So naturally, I've taken a lot of Mac Jones as well. He's tied for my second highest QB exposures. My QB exposures are a little bit lower, but I have taken a lot of those late round New England players, and I agree with you on the Ramondre thing. So anyway, as you were talking through that, I thought that was funny. I haven't really looked at my exposures a lot. Certainly haven't talked about it on pods. But the guys that I'm actually clicking late at tight end, I mean, I feel like every draft it's Gesicki or Henry to build out my tight end builds. Those are just such easy picks late.
And you think about those guys compared to players who don't have the athleticism, are in offenses that are going to be weak, on top of maybe not having the actual tight end volume there for them. One of the things that we are trying to do here, and people are going to disagree with you on who a good player versus a bad player is. That's one of the best things about fantasy football, is having those debates. But we do want to take a zero bad players build, and to get those Patriots guys late. I mean, Hunter Henry coming off a really down kind of portion here with the Patriots, and yet he's still one of these players where the pedigree up through what he did as a near breakout, someone who can definitely get in the end zone. I don't know, in the last round, what you're getting in 2023 at tight end.
It's discounted, that pedigree. Yeah, that pedigree is significantly discounted. There was a point when he was like a fifth round pick, and there's no real reason, like unlike an OJ Howard, where obviously we're not taking him in the fifth round anymore, there's no real reason that Hunter Henry has fallen that far. It's not like he's a significantly different player. He's definitely been in different offenses. There have been different circumstances throughout his career. He's had some near breakouts, like you said. But if you go look at him on a per route basis, it's not like he's a horrible player now. He's had some down seasons at times later in his career. Last year's targets per out run were down quite a bit. Yards per out run down to a career low. Not a good year. Also not a good offense. Nobody really performed in that offense last year. You look back as recently as 2021, he was an effective tight end in New England, on this team. And he's still, presumably a big part of their plans. So yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. Shawn, this team, we were talking at the top about being really excited about drafting together. I don't think I could be I didn't expect to be this excited. Rarely do drafts actually go as well as you're kind of hoping. But honestly, this is one of my favorite teams I've drafted. I love each of the separate rooms. We talked through the tight ends. Quarterbacks will be where the team's made or broken. If Russell Wilson gets benched, as I decided to talk all the way through right before we drafted him, we're not going to be really happy with our Russell Wilson, Kenny Pickett duo. But running back to have Breece, Bijan, and Javonte Williams. I mean, that's like, if Javonte doesn't have the serious injury and Breece doesn't have the injury, you're talking about probably the dynasty running backs 1, 2, 3. Like, these are the young. We like to get into young, talented running backs in our drafts. We have 3 of them, and also some really interesting ones late in Pierre Strong and Ty Chandler. And then receiver, we talked about that blend and that build and how it all meshes. I really, really like this team. If you want to talk about, potential negatives, we can talk about how some of our stacks don't really have bringbacks. We missed Mac Jones late. We have 3 Patriots, and we don't have any Buffalo Bill or Mac Jones, so we're just kind of making a bet on the New England's offense. We do have that Week 16 game with Denver, as you mentioned, really built out, and I love that. Denver, we have a big stack. We don't have the Chargers bring back. We do have the Pittsburgh double stack of Deontay and Freiermuth with Pickett and a bring back of Jackson Smith and Jigba on that one. But we don't have a ton of the bringbacks on our stacks. We have these like multiple player bets on some offenses, but no huge bringbacks. That's maybe the one minor thing that this build is missing. And yet, like, it's a totally fine trade-off when you have, number one, you do have the stacking you've checked, but number two, you have the player selections that you want. You have the build throughout. This team has plenty of upside. We got good ADP value, which is something you were highlighting throughout. You want to not be reaching. You want to be building, somewhat unique combos and not paying up for every single player you take. That has been shown to not be very successful. So this is a team that I'm very, very excited about. We have some interesting little game stacks as well as you're scrolling through. I'm reminded of the discount we got on Evans, and we got Kendre Miller along with our Olave bet. So we have this nice little New Orleans Tampa Bay thing that we talked about. We have some fun stuff built into this roster. I mean, it's one of my favorites so far.
Yeah, and I think especially when you consider that we were able to get the other side of that Olave game for Week 17, it's going to be difficult to have a draft fit so nicely for you that you can make all of the different elements work. It would have been great to get Quentin Johnston falling back through round 7. Mm-hmm. That was the other part of it that we looked at when we were trying to decide between him and Mike Evans. But I think to complement the JSN reach and to build out the overall target volume, the red zone upside, it's just such a perfect play. I wanted to ask you, you were talking about having Godwin as one of your highest exposures. He's one of mine as well. How much do you think that we're giving up by having Evans instead of Godwin? How far apart are you going to have them in your projections?
I do have them pretty substantially gapped. I argued last offseason, astute listeners will remember that, Godwin was coming off an ACL, but if he wasn't coming off the ACL, that the sort of passing of the torch had happened the year prior to Godwin's ACL, and that he looked a lot better than Evans. And if he wasn't coming off an ACL, that Godwin should have been going substantially higher than Evans going into last year. Now, obviously, that wasn't the real reality, but the point was, hey, when Godwin gets healthy in season, he could close the season really well. I remember talking about that very specific prediction that, the second half of the year, I expect Godwin to do much better than Evans. If you look at their sort of per route stuff, Godwin had a weird role last year. The ACL, I remember he talked after the game in Germany against, I believe, the Seahawks, about how that was sort of the first time he felt 100% again. I want to say that was like week 9 or week 10. And prior to that, his ADOT was incredibly low. He was sort of just used as like a screen passer. So his target route run took a bump. His ADOT was a career low, but he's also shown us an ability to win as a downfield player, especially early in his career when he was more rotational and kind of playing alongside Deshaun Jackson in the wide receiver, 3 role with the Bucs. He was like a high ADOT guy, 13 ADOT guy. Then he was in the 10 range for a couple of years. Then these last 2 years, he's been a lot lower, playing with Brady as kind of his underneath option. He's been successful on every single role is the point. He can win at all depths. And the targets per out run has fluctuated with the depth. And so it's more like, if you look at his weighted targets per out run, been very strong almost every year of his career. Same is true for Evans, but that number has come down a little bit for Evans these last couple of years. It did bounce back a little in 2022. So my argument going into 2022 was that the passing the torch had already happened in 2021. 2022, Evans has a decent year kind of bouncing back. And we know that some of the aging receivers, when they're as good as a Mike Evans, who set the all-time record for 1,000-yard seasons to begin a career, that's still going as he's, entering the twilight of his career. When they're that good, they can perform into their 30s. There's age cliffs that we have to be worried about, but some of these guys can continue to perform. He bounces back in a way that makes me more optimistic about him as he is, just entering his early 30s. I mean, he came into the league very young, Sean. I'm looking it up right now, but he's not. He turned 30 actually August 21st, right before the season starts. So he'll play this year at 30, not at 32 or 34, at 30. I mean, I still think he very much has the talent. There's some concern, I think, for me, maybe the biggest thing is the overlap with Baker Mayfield's skill set. We talked about this with the OBJ stuff. I remember Sean on the show, but how that deep intermediate range is an area that Baker really struggles in. He's more of a deep thrower or an underneath guy. I think, Evans is more of that intermediate range. He can also be a deep threat, but that might be a tough overlap with Baker's skill set. At the same time, in terms of, how much am I going to give up on the projections? How much of a gap is there going to be? I don't think it's going to be that massive. And I have taken a lot of Evans as well. I mentioned that Godwin was my highest drafted wide receiver. I do have Evans 19%. He's on my first page as well. I've taken a good amount of him. I think he's a value. And especially when he falls, I take him after ADP most of the time. We just got him way after ADP in this one, especially when you get that kind of a price. You got the high ADOT, you got the proven touchdown potential, you got the big body, vertical threat in a best ball setting. I think you just have to really like that. I just pulled up my projections. I have done Tampa. I have Godwin projected for about 30 more points. I mean, 1.5 to 2 points per game more. I think it's like 27 points actually. So 1.5 to 2 points per game more. I definitely have Godwin projected for more on my base projections. But I have Evans still as, another 1,000-yard season, 1,009 yards is my projection for him. Like, I don't have him as a massive hit or anything, but I do think he's going to be another solid, again, because the high ADOT, because the TD rate, and because the numbers bounced back a little bit last year, the peripherals, he does look like he's going to continue to just chug along and have another solid season.
I mean, this is a guy who last year was going at the end of round 2 in less wide receiver heavy ADP. It really, I think, emphasizes kind of the good fortune that we had when you look at him in our draft in the middle of round 7 there. And then the next 4 wide receivers drafted are Brandon Cooks, Quentin Johnston, Rashad Bateman, and Michael Thomas. Now, Brandon Cooks, if everything goes perfectly with the Cowboys, I mean, maybe those guys are actually somewhat equivalent players. But I would say that next foursome, even though there are things to like, I mean, it's almost more than a full tier down from what you would reasonably expect to be getting from Mike Evans. The Deontay Johnson.
You said that so well, as you always do, but last year he was going in the second round, and it's a better profile now. He actually looked better. I mean, I spent a lot of time just saying that, but you distilled it, and you always do so well at that. But
and I don't want to pick on like the supposed and arguably evidence-based greatest quarterback of all time, but he was hurting Evans more than he hurts the underneath guys. And so, I mean, Evans was boosted because of the 2 big touchdown seasons with Brady. And it made sense to think that some of that could continue. But even if he doesn't have that touchdown upside now with whoever the Bucs decide to throw out there, I don't think that you're actually getting hurt that much from a yardage profile.
I think people would argue
collapse, which, I mean, you could get really, really bad quarterback play, and people are trying to avoid that scenario. And I think that makes some sense. But I mean, price starts to matter in a pretty big way when we're pricing across the different possible scenarios.
Yeah, you make a great point about the Brady thing. Obviously, that's something I've left off, and I'm comparing the massive gap in ADP. People would argue that the pass attempt upside obviously was another big reason he was going so high. And we talk about how projections influence ADP, and certainly the Bucs projected for a lot of pass volume last year, and then were historic in terms of delivering on that. They threw a ton of passes. But it's just like, I mean, are they really going to be below average in pass volume with an immobile quarterback, and they're going to lose? Like, they're not good. Are they? I don't understand why people think the Bucs are going to be like bottom 5 in pass volume. I don't think they're going to be historically high, but if they're league average, you're still getting a good price on Evans in the middle of the 7th round. I mean, that's great.
Well, one of the things that you do here coming out of Tampa too is that, I mean, everybody feels like they're actually too good to tank. And I mean, the Bucs actually have a lot of talent on that roster, and Tom Brady was hurting them badly last year with his play. Now, that's not fixed in any way, shape, or form. They're going to be bad at quarterback again. But, when you look at the volume that Evans was actually able to pull out of that, both from an air yards perspective and from just flat out a target perspective, that's way down from early in his career. And you look at that and say, yeah, I mean, it's way down because now he's 30, he's not 22 anymore. And so you probably are going to continue to see him go down that path, but it's not necessarily guaranteed. And if the targets are very concentrated on Evans and Godwin, which is what they should be if the Buccaneers are trying to win. Then, I mean, both of those guys, I don't know. There's upside at their prices, basically our contention. Then I want to ask you about Diontae Johnson, too. He's an interesting name, similar concerns. And then plus he played just personally very poorly last year, in addition to being hurt by the two-headed monster that was the Pittsburgh Steelers quarterbacks. But I thought it was interesting. I was looking at a piece that Blair Andrews has in progress, and it looks at wide receiver ADP and the predictiveness of it recently and some of the reasons why that's been a little bit down, and quarterbacks, or I should say, sorry, wide receivers who have dramatically outperformed ADP, which obviously when you're getting these gaps between where they were drafted and what they did, that's where you get that lack of predictiveness. But it was interesting because there are several names that are on that list multiple times. And one of the names of guys who dramatically overperformed multiple times is Diontae Johnson, which is interesting because he's coming off of such a terrible year. But with the 2 years prior to that, making that overperform list, it's interesting to see him, especially again, a guy who commands so much target volume, to see him down at these prices.
Yeah, I just recently did my Pittsburgh projection as well. And I mean, it's just so funny to look at his profile, because this guy has racked up 144, 169, and 147 targets the last 3 seasons. And yet he hasn't had a yards per target over 7 in any of those years. After he earns the volume, he's just not good. So I wrote, in my notes, his horrible yards per target relative to any other high volume wide receiver over multiple years. I look at that efficiency multiple ways. I also look at Racer, and I depth adjust for the player's ADOT, because Racer goes up and down relative to the depth of the average depth of target. But Racer is the conversion ratio of air yards to receiving yards of total air yards. But you do sort of need to adjust for the average depth of the target. Having said that, he's had a negative depth adjusted Racer, 3 years in a row, pretty substantially negative. The thing that I was arguing last year with him was he gets so much volume. He has, upside here if he just could get strong efficiency 1 year. And I remember saying multiple times to you, Sean, there's no way that the efficiency can really get worse. He can't even get to 7 yards per target. It got worse. His yards per target last year of 6.0 was a career low. The previous career low was 6.4. He also scored 0 touchdowns somehow. It was just comical how inefficient he was on a per target basis, both in terms of yardage and touchdowns. And yet he earned another 147 targets. You look at his, targets per out run, they continue to be very strong. At his price, it's the same argument as last year. He can't continue to be this bad forever. He obviously earns a ton of volume. I mean, it's like, if he's just league average efficiency, he's an absolute smash in the 6th round.
You would think so. And the thing that people, I think, know, but it's hard to to fully respect or have it completely sink in, is just how bad the QBs were before last year and what Ben Roethlisberger was doing down the stretch. And so you think even a bad rookie or a bad veteran rookie combo is going to be floor-wise pretty similar, and there's some upside if they were to hit quickly. Well, the floor outcome is more or less what you got. And then on top of that, Johnson continued to politic for targets, and then he went out there, and when they did throw to him, just played terrible football. And so in the past, that yard per target element that seemed on the QB almost exclusively and within the context of where he's actually getting the targets. In 2022, it seemed to be, again, a combination, but much more on him. Now, when you're looking at 2023, the question is, does that actually create a breaking point where they de-emphasize him slightly on the offense, or do you just get the natural bounce back that you would expect to get from someone who is just open every play? He gets open at will. I think it makes an interesting dynamic. It's especially interesting when you consider it within the context of George Pickens, who is so difficult to evaluate in his own right because of the injuries that he had in college after a very encouraging rookie season. He has the highlights last year. He doesn't necessarily draw the target volume you would want. He's an interesting personality. He's already telling people that he's offended that he's not considered one of the top wide receivers in the entire NFL. He's probably got to do a little more on the field to justify that. But I mean, you could see this Steelers passing offense go anywhere from both of those guys breaking out and the whole thing being pretty electric to handing the ball to Najee Harris, who breaks 5 tackles in the backfield and still loses 7 yards, and then punting and trying to play defense.
Well, and I mean, I have a lot of Pittsburgh takes, but they've played fast and they've thrown it at a high rate for a number of years now. And obviously some of that included Ben Roethlisberger, but they still did it last year. I think, even if there's some the fact that you get both of those elements is a positive for the volume. There could be some play volume regression. There could be some pass rate regression, but, probably you're going to still get decent volume, even if they both regress a little bit. But like one thing I would say is one could offset the other in a positive way for what we want to see, which is more volume. So if they do throw enough, you have those two guys. I talked favorably about Pat Freiermuth as well. And then the other guy that's going to run a lot of routes, Sean, is one of those sneaky benefits to a passing game where you have Allen Robinson lining up there and potentially running a lot of routes with them, but not actually doing anything, which doesn't draw volume away from the other players. We used to talk about this a lot with AJ Green, where like it's actually kind of a minor bump to the other guys in the passing game when he was still running routes late into his career at such a high rate. Maybe Allen Robinson hits, but that's obviously not something that we're betting on very heavily. And if he doesn't, but he plays a lot, Deontay Johnson can still concentrate a lot of volume, and George Pickens can still see more. It is funny that he thinks that highly of himself when he had a 14.5% targets per out run last year, did not really earn volume, 1.38 yards per out run, not great. Was efficient after the target, and we know that from Blair's great work that efficiency leads to more volume in year 2. And I think Pickens is a reasonable bet to take a step forward. I really like this passing game to be concentrated between Deontay, Pickens, and Freiermuth. I like all of their profiles independently for the things that they're good at and the reasons to be in on them. I'm fine with all of their prices. I think the offense as a whole should throw a decent amount. And then the other kind of big take I have on the Steelers is Najee Harris has a little bit of like 2022 CEH risk, in my opinion, where he's had a sub 4 yards per carry 2 years in a row. He started to lose work to Jaylen Warren last year. If he comes out and is inefficient again this year, even if he's getting some, like, remember CEH last year after 5 or 6 weeks, we were talking about how he was adding nothing to the offense, and yet it felt crazy. And people in the fantasy community were like, "Well, CH has scored 6 touchdowns so far." I mean, yeah, he had like 6 touchdowns early in the year, and they were arguing. Obviously, he's still valuable because he's doing the things that we want in fantasy football. And yet the Chiefs eventually were like, "No, this is not enough. Like, just they saw it the way we saw it. You're doing what the offense is giving you. You're not adding anything to this." And ultimately they stopped playing him. I don't think it will go that far with Najee Harris, but Jaylen Warren, an efficient backup behind him last year, did start to steal a little bit more and more work down the stretch. If Najee Harris comes out and is a sub 4 yards per carry player again this year, you're talking about maybe they'll hand off to him a bunch. I mean, I think he has to suddenly be efficient. There's not a lot of reasons to argue that he will be. If he's not efficient, I mean, I think there's concern that not only will they not run a lot, but they will go away from Najee in year 3. Because how many years in a row can you do it? It's kind of like, you have a 4-year rookie contract. Year 3 is about the point where if you've done nothing, we give up on you. I mean, the other guy that Najee's been using the same sentence with is Trent Richardson. You go back to Trent Richardson's rookie year, he was actually fantasy viable. This is something we talked about. Inefficient, but scored double-digit touchdowns, had 1,300 yards. I just pulled it up, 12 TDs. Within a couple of years, he got traded mid-season the next year to Indy, who famously gave up a first-round pick for him, even though he was inefficient and looked like a bust already. And then wasn't very good in Indy in year 3. And by the end of year 3, it was like, okay, we're done with you. You're out of the league. You only get so many opportunities is the point. And Najee has not done well over the last couple of years. He's in a precarious situation. Obviously, he could still play well and re-earn the heavy volume. He actually did a little bit late. If you go look at his game log, had a couple 20-carry games down the stretch. I think in the final week they gave him a ton of volume. Earned some of that back from Jaylen Warren, but he's in a little. I mean, I think more so than people want to admit and realize, he's in a situation where if he plays poor again, they're not going to just suffer through another 300 touch poor season, or at least I don't think so. Or at least I would say there's risk that they don't, right, relative to his cost. And then the flip side of that would be the offense shifts and we're throwing more and we're playing Jaylen Warren kind of like the Bengals did, as you alluded to earlier in the show, with Samaje Perine, and using him and throwing more and being more aggressive with their offense at times. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how the Steelers play out, but they're a really fun offense that, because of some of the ineffective players like Allen Robinson and Najee Harris, I feel more confident being aggressive on the exciting profiles that they have.
Their identity for 2023 will be, I think, one of the most important elements of the entire season, because you do have a team here that, depending on how healthy their defensive stars are, can be so dynamic defensively that if Kenny Pickett doesn't take a step forward, you could get a sea change. Again, you can get a very conservative style offense. And so you do have a handful of pivotal players within that team to where the way they play is going to determine then the entire style for the squad for a season. I think that brings risk for some of these players that we're excited to draft, but also it's just really exciting. I think these teams that have a lot of different ways they could go is what makes fantasy football so much fun. Najee Harris, I mean, our comparison of him to Trent Richardson has been very accurate. I mean, one of the reasons why I don't like to come out with a lot of, this guy's going to bust types of takes is that then when you're right, you've kind of been right about someone's career not going the way that would have been great for them. And so, you feel that kind of regret even when you end up being vaguely correct. I think he could bounce back. I mean, we're looking at him right now. He's basically Josh Jacobs, but without the good price. And so, for drafters, that's a huge problem, because if you're right, I don't think that you're going to actually win that much, because Jaylen Warren is going to come in and get some of those touches. He's just too much more dynamic that if it's a very functional rushing offense, he's going to lose some of those touches there. And we love the way this team turned out. Is there anything now, once we have a little bit of time and you don't have that 25 seconds when you're on the clock and trying to figure it out with another person, anything you would do differently?
I don't think there were a lot of those outcomes in the draft. We had some, I think, pretty clear picks. One of the biggest discussion points we had was in the first round, Bijan and Kelsey. And I was going to say to you at some point, I was excited to potentially try a Kelsey Mahomes team. I haven't built that yet. I'm really glad we didn't in this room, the way that things fell. It could have still been an interesting team with those Deontay and Evans values when you're not building the early receivers. But the way things fell in the late part with the late round quarterbacks and the late round tight ends that we were able to do, I just think it would have been a fun team with Kelsey Mahomes and then going Breece, Judy, JSN, Deontay, Evans. That would have been a really interesting build as well. But I like the way that we got Bijan and Olave to spark really good. I don't think our receivers would have been deep enough and our running backs would have been deep enough. Otherwise, obviously, we would have done some things differently in various ranges. But into the middle rounds, I really liked the way that we played receiver and the guys that were available for us. And when we took JSN and Deontay, the Quentin Johnston, Mike Evans situation, the 7th that we discussed, Johnston as a bring back would have made a lot of sense. But my thought on that was mostly just like, it wouldn't have been that big of a deal if Evans wouldn't have fallen way behind ADP. But the fact that he did made me want him. I think he was 12 picks behind ADP or whatever it was. Johnston, we would have been taking a little bit ahead of ADP. It's a little unfortunate that we didn't get Johnston onto this build because of how Denver heavy it worked out towards the end. But that's just more of the thing where the room gave us something that we took, and I'm very comfortable with the Evans pick there. I want to take Evans in that scenario, especially when we already have Olave and we're building out correlation with Evans as well. I thought Elijah Moore was a really good pick, especially as we talked through that. Interesting, there Zay Flowers goes one pick after him, Sutton later in the round, Jamison Williams later in the round, Juju, a guy we're probably both not very on, later in the round. That's where the wide receiver window closes. Right before him was the Bateman and Thomas picks that that you mentioned earlier. And so, yeah, you got to pick your spots carefully in that range. The 10th round was an interesting one where we took Freiermuth, but we were talking through Cook at a really big discount. And now that we wound up with a big New England build at the end, I did think through that a little bit and think, man, Cook would have been interesting there as well. Obviously, Freiermuth plays into our Pickett, Deontay, Freiermuth, JSN build. You know, it's one of those things where you'd like to get both of them. Again, just like the Evans and Quentin Johnston situation, we got good values on both, or had good values on both. Freiermuth, we got like 8 picks after ADP. Cook was going something like, 15 picks after ADP at that point. And I know you really wanted to take him. We never circled back on that, but that was one that I definitely thought about more as we were finishing up and as we were getting more New England pieces. It would have been interesting to see how it would have looked with Cook on that build. But then Mac Jones ended up going a little before we would have been able to consider him. And so it's not like we would have ended up being able to build out a New England Buffalo stack, I don't think. So anyway, the way that the rest of it panned out, I mean, no, I don't think there's really anything else that I would have done differently. The late picks were, the targets, in my opinion.
You do a lot of drafts where the value will get taken one spot ahead of you, in part because it is a value, and the drafter ahead of you also wants that. And so you do have a little bit of regret that maybe players didn't slide even farther, or maybe you're planning to reach on someone and someone reaches even a little bit more. You can get in these dynamics where maybe you're battling the person next to you even to fill out some of the game stacks. And that can be something that is tricky as you work through. This draft fell almost perfectly. And so if the team isn't good, we don't have any excuses from that perspective. Maybe the only area that does seem kind of provocative or controversial would be the Freiermuth pick. Now, it was a great pick. It fit exactly what we wanted to do. And having information now that we didn't have when we drafted, would you prefer Freiermuth and Pierre Strong, or would you prefer James Cook and Michael Mayer, someone who, it's a rookie tight end, and the rookie tight ends in terms of Laporta and Kincaid are probably overvalued, even though they're very exciting players. And if they hit, like some of the names you have to kind of cherry pick out because, again, rookie tight ends haven't done much. If they hit like that, everybody's going to feel like, we could see this coming. These guys were elite athletes. They had a role in the offense. They were good picks because once you get in the double-digit rounds, when you're talking about tight ends, the ceiling isn't there anyway. Mayer, someone who a very similar prospect, even though the athleticism is the one thing that's really different. It's interesting to see the guy who probably was the better college player, but not as athletic, falling to this point. When you look at those kind of two players next to each other, those two opportunities, do you have a preference for the one we went with, or do you have a preference for the Cook and Mayer? And again, you don't know that you're going to be able to get Mayer in the last round, but he does go in that range very frequently.
I have not been taking a lot of Mayer. I totally see the argument for him. I just think the Raiders might be pretty bad. I haven't been taking a lot of Raiders at all. I just don't, love the situation there. And so to answer your question, I mean, it comes down to a little bit down to Pierre Strong versus Mayer, where for me, Strong has been more of a late round target than Mayer. And in part, I haven't taken Mayer because in the past, I've wanted to build into the rookie upside tight end profiles late because there haven't been a lot of options. But when you talk about Gesicki and Hunter Henry sitting there, and even Dawson Knox sitting there, there is some Tyler Conklin I've taken a little bit. There are some veterans in the last few rounds at tight end that I think are very viable picks in the last few rounds. Like, just not hard to take. I'm taking some Trey McBride as another youngster. I would totally have been fine taking Mayer and been open to it. But he hasn't been a major target for me. Strong has been an interesting running back profile for me. And then again, I talked a lot favorably about Freiermuth, and you said that for this question, knowing how it turned out, I mean, obviously we ended up taking Pickett and getting a value on him, and we weren't able to get Mac. And so I'm not necessarily quite as concerned about the New England Buffalo game, having a bring back on that. I would still sit with Freiermuth. I like that pick a lot. I really like his profile in the 10th round. I think he's a really clear tight end target.
We need to do a few more of these drafts with Pat so we can get someone to talk us down off of our Steelers enthusiasm, because we're going to be very Pittsburgh heavy. There's just so many ways in which that can work out in a positive, but anytime you have a quarterback who may not be very good, you've got a lot of risk. Ben, this was so much fun. I mean, we're an hour and 45 minutes in now as we kind of work through it. I'm looking forward to doing some more of these with you as the summer moves along.
Yeah, it's going to be an absolute blast.
So that'll bring us to the end of Stealing Bananas today. It's a special Underdog Best Ball Mania 4 draft. As Ben mentioned at the top, we're looking to win the $3 million, maybe win that $500,000 for the best regular season team. We'll see if our two QBs put up enough points to drag the team along to that type of finish. For Ben Gretch, I am Shawn Siegele, but make sure you're over there subscribing at Stealing Signals, subscribing at Stealing Lines. I know you're listening to Ben on Ship Chasing and all of those awesome shows that they're doing. It's just so cool to be part of that environment. You can follow me with Pete on Wednesday mornings at the Best Ball Breakfast. Colin and I have a bunch of FFPC shows that are now out if you're wanting to draft in that format. And Ben, it's always so much fun to do those. We're going to have a few more of those as well, but the Superflex element, absolutely crazy. So join us at OT, join us at RotoViz. You can use the coupon code RVRadio2023 at checkout to get 10% off your 1-year subscription. If you want to go do one of these drafts yourself and win the $3 million, use the coupon code RotoViz. You get the 100% deposit match up to $100. Yeah. Again, we thank you guys. This is so much fun. We love you. We'll talk to you soon.